As the Director of Community Access, Mary Reaves ensures that buildings, programs, organizations, community spaces, and more are ready and willing to provide access to all members of their community, including those with disabilities. Mary has worked in the accessibility space for more than 10 years, but her focus was more narrowly focused on language accessibility. She is passionate about accessibility as it is the pathway to belonging. Mary is a rehabilitation counselor by training who worked in deaf mental health for nearly 10 years before co-founding Beginnings South Carolina. She spent more than 10 years with Beginnings SC, building and managing programs that include parent counseling, services for child care providers, advocacy and policy, training and technical assistance, and awareness and education to support the families and professionals who serve deaf and hard of hearing children. She received her bachelor's in psychology from U of SC and later a master's in rehabilitation counseling from the U of SC School of Medicine in 2009 with a certificate in deaf studies, and through this program learned American Sign Language. Mary received a certificate in special education advocacy from William and Mary Law School in 2021 and has gone on to support families, including her own, as they navigate the educational needs of children with disabilities. Mary has served on the board of directors for community organizations, including Girls Rock Columbia, and is currently a member of the advisory board of the Hive Community Circle. Mary's goal is to help remove the barriers put into place when access is not provided. Mary, we're honored to have you join us today, and at this point, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll tell you, having someone tell people about yourself is always one of those interesting things, isn't it? So hopefully y'all are not bored already. I'm really happy to be here to talk with you about programmatic and environmental accessibility. Really just want to give you a little bit of an overview and leave you with some takeaways. So I'm going to get us started here. Maybe. There we go. Okay, y'all don't need to know anything else about me. I think you heard it all. Currently the Director of Community Access here at ABLE. So today, I hope that you will learn a thorough understanding of programmatic and environmental barriers, an overview of legal obligations under ADA and Rehab, and tips really for making services and supports more inclusive. But before I do that, who is ABLE South Carolina? We are a disability-led organization seeking transformational changes in systems, communities, and individuals. We have been around since 1994, so celebrating our 30th year. We're the state's oldest and largest center for independent living. We serve more youth with disabilities than any organization, any center for independent living in the country. More than 3/4 of our staff are people with disabilities, including myself, and over half of our board of directors. So we don't just learn about this, we live this every day. Our computer mission and vision. We're an organization of people with disabilities leading the charge to equip, educate, and advocate. We want people with disabilities to have tools to foster pride and direct their own lives, educate the community to challenge stereotypes, eliminate barriers, very much what we're going to be talking about today, and advocate for access, equity, inclusion at the individual, local, state, and national level. And we do even some international work. Our CEO was in the country of Georgia last summer, helping them craft what will be their own version of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And our vision really is a South Carolina that is a national model of equity and inclusion for all people with disabilities. And Lynn said this a moment ago, but please, 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 as we are moving along, if you have questions, type them in the chat, come off mute, come off video. I would love to interact and engage with you. And so don't be afraid to do that. So as I started to build this presentation today, you heard I completed my MRC a little bit longer ago than I think I realized. Every time you hear the date, I go, ooh. But I've been thinking about what I've learned about disabilities in the years since I completed my master's, and then how much I learned in practice that I didn't have to learn, that I wasn't able to learn in school. And I thought about really what makes a rehab counselor different from other counselors. And I want to highlight some of those that we're going to talk about a little bit, and really talk about how we have lots of opportunities for accessibility and inclusion. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I hope you'll leave with today is that as an ally, for folks that are non-disabled, as allies, it's critical for you to help your client find their voice, help them learn how to advocate for what they need. We're looking at understanding the functional implications of their disability, but when a person with a disability comes and fully understands that, maybe they're not newly disabled. I think I was originally thinking about that, and when I remember studying and learning how to provide services to people who were newly disabled. But so often we meet clients who were born with a disability. Have a chronic health condition. I've had it in my entire life. I understand the functional implications of my disability. What I struggle with is helping other people understand that, right? So I hope that I can help you shift your thinking a little bit, or further validate what you're already doing and how you can do that, and using your voice to help amplify the voices of the disabled clients that you serve. So again, just kind of grabbed a couple of these. What is a rehab counselor? I'm not going to read this to you. I took it right from the CRCC 2021 job task analysis. I've linked that here if you do want to read that. I also was looking at some of the enforceable standards of CRCC when I'm looking at what am I going to talk to you about programmatic and environmental accessibility. And I'm going to focus on just a couple things: advocacy and accessibility, and then technology, not so much social media, a little bit of virtual counseling. So those are some of the things that I've embedded throughout today. And I think I'm a little behind on my slides, y'all. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, so first we're going to hop in and talk about barriers to services. Again, I'm giving you an overview and some opportunities. So the types of barriers typically receiving services, lots of different obstacles. Architecture, transportation, policies, programs, social, and attitudinal. I would love for you, if you can think of some examples that you have seen in your counseling practice, or that clients have talked to you about, toss them in there. Let's toss them in the chat. Let's see if we can get some ideas and talk a little bit about some things. Maybe also barriers that fall into multiple categories. Having only one wheelchair accessible entrance, it's in the back of the building. That's an architectural and an attitudinal barrier. Who wants to enter by the trash in the back when everybody else enters in the front, right? Architectural barriers, those are physical barriers that make it impossible or difficult for people with disabilities to access places. So maybe that's a lack of ADA compliant ramps, very heavy doors, poorly maintained sidewalks. Rideshare refusals due to having animal service. Yes, Melissa put that in there. Stairs, historic buildings are very common. Yeah, those are great examples. And we're going to talk a little bit about both of those. A transportation barrier, lack of accessible transportation just in general, or like Melissa said just here. Policies, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those, but maybe, we don't do virtual counseling. We don't provide virtual services, is a policy barrier. Programmatic barrier and absence of accommodations, maybe providing sign language interpreters, having workstations, scheduling accessibility, alternative formats, social and attitudinal, the idea that individuals with disabilities are either heroic or inferior. And that is something that we encounter all too often. And if you have seen any of our trainings from Dory Tempio, you have heard her talk about inspiration porn, and it is all too common. The lack of proper disability terminology is also an attitudinal barrier. So we're going to talk a little bit about those, but first we're going to talk about architectural barriers and what we can do. So how do we even determine where to start? Who decides what barriers? How do I figure out what is important and not important? So the DOJ, Department of Justice, has a checklist for readily achievable barrier removal. These priorities are based on the 4 principles recommended by the Title III regulations, and those include accessible entrance, access to goods and services, access to restrooms, and then any other measures necessary. Those are 1 through 4. And number 1 makes sense to me, right? If I can't get into your building, doesn't really matter what you got going on inside. It's kind of basic, right? So we start there. I got a couple of examples here we're going to look at and talk about. And again, I invite you to use the chat. So I've got some images here, barrier priority 1, accessible entrance to the facility, and we're looking at parking. I'm going to describe these images here. And then while I'm doing so, share what you think the barriers are. The image on the left is a white brick building with 2 gray stairs leading up to a door. There's a boat hook is hanging up on the wall. They've got a sign hanging that's chalkboard. The right image is a close-up picture of a parking space. There's a sign that says handicap parking only, and it's located in front of a set of stairs. See if I've got anybody in here tossing up some ideas. Well, I will go ahead and tell you on the left, we've got a couple things, and you can't tell how wide the door is, but the doorway is too narrow. It's not to standard. And there's 2 steps up and there's no ramp. And there's actually not an accessible entrance anywhere in this building, nor did they have any ramps available. They hadn't thought about programmatic accommodations, all kinds of issues in this building and providing services to folks. We've got steps and stairs and a curb at the parking space. That image on the right, one of the biggest things that jumps out at me immediately is that it says handicapped parking. I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but handicapped, the word is nowhere in any of the laws. It dates back to a law from the 1400s in England where a law was passed that people with disabilities, who were not called people with disabilities at that time, were permitted to put their cap in their hand, handicap, and sit on the street side and beg for money. So, we can kind of think of how that mindset has continued and how that's sort of a loaded word, right? So handicap signs really just need to say reserved parking, accessible parking, need to have the international symbol of accessibility. Additionally, there's stairs. This space was located nowhere near the accessible entrance. So great, they had a spot, but it's so far away from the accessible entrance, it doesn't make sense. And what I want you to think about as we're walking through all of these is just because there's a sign doesn't mean it's accessible. Those are things we have to challenge. And I'm gonna give you some take-home tips after that of ways to do that. So our second set of examples on barrier priority 1, accessible entrance to the facility, paths of travel. You're required to have a safe path of travel from your accessible spot, from public transportation, on getting to the entrance, getting to the accessible entrance. And note, 60% of your entrances should be accessible. So if you have 2, then they both have to be. This image on the left is some white painted lines on a sidewalk pathway. We have some diagonal lines and then one that's indicating a straight path of travel. And it goes in between 2 wooden fence posts into a parking lot. And then you cross the parking lot to get to a set of steps. There is a ramp on the far side of the building. But a couple things in that image, we have a path that's very clearly marked. It's nice, it's appropriate, it's the right, it's not, too steep, all those things, but it goes straight into a parking space. So what if someone is parked there? That becomes a non-accessible path of travel. Additionally, we don't have any directional signage that says, how do you get to the accessible entrance? So when I'm thinking about paths of travel, I want to think about how do I provide someone an opportunity to get there safely? And we're going to talk about signs in just a moment, but that's also missing there. The image on the right is a driveway with a curb, and there's a green space with 4 stepping stones that goes to a brick patio. And this patio was a space that was used for some outside services. There was a beautiful picnic table. It was really shady. There was a monument there, all kinds of things to see and do and services that were provided for everyone to use, but there's no accessible path of travel to get there. So something else to think about, the ADA says if I provide it for people without disabilities, I have to provide an opportunity for people with disabilities to enjoy it too. So access to goods and services in the physical space, and I've got just kind of some generic pictures here. The others are all things that I've taken from doing site assessments. But an office it does have clothes hanging in the back. You know, COVID, we provided counseling in all sorts of spaces in the last couple of years, right? A very small office, a table that's kind of in the way, a barrier to getting to our services is, can I even navigate your office? I've gotten in the door, there's a ramp, it was great, the accessible parking was good, but I can't get into your office. There's no room for a wheelchair to turn around. And the bottom one, I've just got an image of, you know, some seating options again, is we have this really cozy couch and a person sitting in a chair. Is there an alternative space? If, you know, Dory was mentioning before, Dory says, you know, she brings her own chair. She uses a power chair. She says, I bring my own. Is there a place for her to be comfortable and communicate? So thinking about how that can be a barrier. Moving on to access to goods and services again, signage. These are all signs of restrooms, and access to restrooms is actually barrier priority 3, but signage and finding out where to go can be a barrier to getting where you need. So that could be, like I said, directional signage on getting into the building. That could be finding the appropriate office. All permanent spaces should be identified with signs that include Braille. And if I don't have, if we're not providing information on how to find the office, let's say, you know, you have used a booking link and you send it out to a client and they are to meet you directly in room 103. Is 103 appropriately labeled? If not, that can be a barrier. And that doesn't mean I want you to go buy a Braille printer and figure that out, but that just means we do some planning, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Additionally, the far right picture, the far left picture, I've got a close-up of a tape measure, and just to highlight, I'm stopping myself for just a moment. I am doing image descriptions here for images on the screen, and that is me modeling some accessibility. I don't know who all is present in our webinar recording today. I don't know if everybody has access to the images, and so I am modeling for you that accessibility opportunity there to make sure that I'm not just assuming access to all the information. So back to far left picture, we have a tape measure on a restroom sign, and it's showing that the Braille is about 60.5 inches. It's actually a little bit too high. And why does that matter? Well, if I've gone through orientation and mobility training and I know to anticipate, you know, roughly 60 inches is where Braille should be, and I'm, you know, tracking a wall and trying to find the room 103 where I need to go, and the sign is not where I anticipate it, am I going to find it? Even just an inch. So providing opportunities for things to be consistent and as expected is really important for accessibility as well. Our middle image is a picture of a restroom that has a sign, and it's got a great door handle, something that can be used with a closed hand. I'll talk a little bit more about that in, I think, 2 slides. The far right image is of a restroom again, and a sign, but the sign is on the door. Can anybody tell me why it might be problematic to have a sign on a door? And I'm going to wait and see if anybody has an answer for me on this one. Yes, thank you, Melissa. Someone who's looking for the sign may get hit by the door. Absolutely. I have a friend who's been blind since birth and uses Braille to navigate spaces and be informed. And the number of times there's been a sign on a door and she's been like, am I in the right place? And the door comes open and in she goes. Not only is that a safety hazard, but also not a fun experience, very humiliating, right? So the sign should always be on the latch side of the door, to make sure that there is access, there's opportunity, there's room, and that it's safe. Signs, I mentioned barrier priority 2, access to goods and services provided signs. So I've got 3 images here. The typical blue and white sign, and y'all, it does not have to be blue and white. I just want to tell you, everybody thinks it does. Nothing in the law says it has to be blue. It can be whatever color. You do have to have the international symbol of accessibility, and that's changing just a little bit. A lot of times you'll see a wheelchair that looks like it's more in motion, which I think is super cool. But our left sign just says accessible entrance and has an arrow. Our top middle sign has a pictogram of a female and the international symbol of accessibility, the wheelchair symbol, an arrow, restroom, and braille. And then we have a no pets allowed with the international symbol of accessibility and a dog, and service dogs are welcome. So these are all 3 very different and very important. So if you have multiple entrances to your space and only one of them is accessible, you need to have a sign that says where that is. And think about backtracking, right? So, or let's say I have 3 entrances. And the accessible entrance is around the far side, but the main entrance is over here to the left. Saving someone from having to go all the way over here to this entrance to go, I can't get in there. Backtracking. Someone with mobility disabilities or using crutches or temporarily disabled with a cast on their leg. If I can prevent someone from having to backtrack and save the physical energy of doing that, absolutely. The ADA also says I need to do that. Have to have wayfinding signs. The same thing for a restroom. If you have multiple restrooms and they're not all accessible, you need to identify the one that is and have directional signage providing that. You can have a no pets policy, that is fine. If you have signage that says a no pets policy, you must include a sign that says service dogs are welcome. That is protected by the ADA to allow service dogs into any space. There are some rules about service dogs. I'm not going to go into those. I do have some resources at the end if you have questions. I'm happy to answer those, but I've got a full resource to kind of highlight some of those at the end for you. Barrier priority 3, access to restrooms. I've got a top image of a restroom that looks pretty accessible, has a couple images, or a couple issues, 2 toilet paper holders. It's got handrails. Our bottom image is a sink that looks to have knee toe clearance, but doesn't actually. The sink is not quite where it needs to be. And then a beautiful accessible restroom, really more universally designed. It's got handlebars that fall down. It's got grab bars by the sink, but it's being used as a storage space. I have provided many services in many places. I was in a closet in a school for several years. I've been in lots of places where we don't have a lot of place to put things. And I can't tell you how often I remember seeing this, but also I see it now doing site assessments. The accessible restroom, because it's used rarely, is a jumping ground for a lot of things. So walk your space, check that, make sure that's not the case. And if it is, figure out how to make sure whoever's putting it there knows that's not okay. That's not a place. Make sure that's reserved and accessible. All right, barrier priority 4, other measures as necessary if you provide, if you have a scale, if you are in a medical practice and folks need to be weighed, making sure there's a scale that's accessible. Fire alarms that are visual as well as audible. Those are all covered in barrier priority 4. And I've got an image here of a visual fire alarm. On the left and top right is an accessible scale that actually folds out onto the floor and a wheelchair can roll right on to it. And for those of you who might be in any medical practices, there was recently a final rule implemented impacting Health and Human Services that says all practices are going to have accessible medical equipment. I'm not going to go into any of that stuff today. If you have questions, aren't sure what that might mean for you, reach out. Happy to clarify and give you some more information on that. So if you've seen some of these pictures and you're like, uh-oh, what do I do? Or you're not sure, the first thing I recommend is that you walk your space and you look for barriers. If you can't fix those, you don't own your space, find out who can. Figure out what to do. You're like, okay, we have no signs. Uh-oh, we don't have a ramp. Uh-oh, we have a push button automatic door opener on the front, but it doesn't work. Look for those things. Something you can do is have portable ramps available if your building doesn't have a ramp. They're not super pricey. We loan them out to members of the community, people with disabilities, and we've purchased those at they're not as expensive as I thought. I mentioned your directional signage. Make sure it is available, accurate, and readable. Again, don't assume that just because you've seen the International Symbol of Accessibility, I'm going to call him Bob, just because you see a sign of Bob, that it means it's accessible. It might not be. If there's a sign that's faded, find out who can replace it for you. Maybe have wheelchairs that are available for use. Have comfortable and varied seating options in your waiting rooms and your offices. And then also, again, make sure there's a space if someone brings their own chair or mobility device, that there's a spot for that in your waiting room. And it's not in the middle of the room, right? There's a place and it's, okay, this is great. And here I do have the symbol, the International Symbol of Accessibility, the kind of newer version, if you will, in blue, where it looks like this person is in motion. A few more physical accessibility recommendations, maybe some adjustable seating options. And then thinking specifically for offices, not necessarily waiting rooms, but maybe adjustable lighting options for sensory sensitivities. Maybe you have lamps in your office. Maybe you, can close your blinds. You've got curtains. I have migraines, and overhead lights can often trigger a migraine for me. And so going into a space where there's an overhead light and it can be problematic. So the option to say, hey, could we maybe turn that off and turn a lamp on? So thinking about those sorts of things can remove a physical barrier. Are there elements of your office that are not accessible? Let people know. If you know that the restroom is out of service, let your client know. Let folks know. Planning is really critical. I have a friend who uses a wheelchair, loves to go to the theater, for example. But one of the local places that she goes doesn't have accessible restrooms. And so she's like, okay, well, I know I'm probably not going to go out to eat before I go. I'm not going to meet friends for drinks and then go because the restroom is not accessible. So planning is really important. We can't remove all barriers at all times, but we can make sure folks are aware. This one is huge. Avoid use of strong scents in your office. I mentioned that our staff is 3/4 of our staff are people with disabilities. And that includes all types. I mentioned migraines. We've got folks with asthma. We've got folks with all sorts of chemical sensitivities. And scents can be really problematic. So think about that. If you have plugins in your office, if you, spray in between things, if you light candles, think about that. Find out from your clients if there's something, if this is problematic. I'm not saying don't use it. But maybe if you know that you have a client coming who has indicated some sensory disabilities, and when you're asking about accommodations, that you remove that plugin, maybe, the night before, they're coming in, or you find another office to use. So again, it doesn't mean you don't do these things, but you have them in the back of your head so you can accommodate and think about. Be prepared to provide orientation to your space if necessary. If you have someone who comes in who's blind or low vision, and again, you're checking about accommodations ahead of time. But you say, would you like to me to give you a tour of this building so you know where everything is so you can navigate it independently? They might say yes, they might say no. But thinking about that can be a great opportunity to make someone feel welcome and included. You've thought about what I need before I get there. You understand there are some barriers here, and you're willing to work around those. Lastly, maintain what you have. The ADA, that is a compliance issue. If you have it, you can't just have it, you have to maintain it. So let's say you have grab bars in your bathroom and they're rusted. That's out of compliance. Find your maintenance folks, or if you are the maintenance folks, like I have been in many of my professional settings, take care of it. If your paint is peeling outside, if your ramp has a big crack in it, I mentioned the push button auto door opener. You're not required to have an auto front door opener, but if you do have one, it has to work. If it doesn't, fix it. Find out who can. So monitoring really is part of compliance. And it's part of making sure that you are barriers. So back to that first recommendation I said, walk your space, take a look, figure out what's going on. And we've got a comment here. People with autism react to sense find. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd say always react to strong sense, find them distracting many times. And so, important to think about that. Some alternatives to barrier removal. So often I'll talk with folks, and I'm out doing these site assessments and they're like, well, I can't fix that. I don't own this building. I don't know what to do. So what do we do then? Well, maybe we deliver our goods or services to an alternate location. We relocate our activities. Also, thank you. Yes. Can we always readily do that? Have a counseling space, it's private. Can we just readily go someplace else? I don't know, but think about that. Having a conversation with your client. Okay, what can we do? Can we move it to virtual? Let's say someone comes into the office and, they're leaving and you're like, up front, there are some brochures of some referral options for you or whatever. They're up high. Walk out there and grab them, or make sure the front desk knows that, if someone comes in and is like, I'm looking for some brochures, they're ready to retrieve those and provide that. Provide teleservices. Even if your policy has returned to in-person only, that is, and we're going to talk about policy barriers a little bit, but that's a policy barrier. Just because it's in your policy doesn't mean you can deny accessibility. And if your building is not accessible and there's no other way to provide that, then maybe you look at teleservices again. But make sure it's an accessible platform. If you're not sure about that, touch base, we can help you with that. Recently, I was somewhere where they had accessible restrooms, but they were located down a hall around the corner, and to the back was the only place where an accessible stall was. And all the services happened up front. Well, they also happened to have an employee-only restroom up front, and it was perfectly accessible. And so I said, you know what? You're creating a barrier here. I understand the need for an employee-only restroom, but also, this is not really providing access. So think about that. If there's something that can be opened up for folks with disabilities, do so. Delivering items or resources to the car, outside, again, location. Don't be afraid to get creative. I'm reading a book by Judy Heumann, who was really the leader in the civil rights movement. She helped with the passing of 504. And, she was one of those who was at the sit-in and they shut it down for 20 something days. And I'm reading her book right now, and she talks about her journey. She had polio at 2, I believe. And so used a wheelchair from that time on. And she talked about how playing in the streets, she grew up in New York, and all of her friends always helped her figure out. She played every game they played. She did everything they did. And she never thought about it until it was time to go to school, and they wouldn't accept her in school. And she said, I think the biggest barrier there was adults forget how to be creative. Adults forget how to think outside the box and go, we can be problem solvers. And most often, if you talk to your client, to your person with a disability, they've got a ton of ideas because we've been doing this a long time. We've navigated a lot of experiences. We've navigated a lot of barriers. So ask us, do you have an idea how we could do this? I think one of the biggest things that we can do as allies to people with disabilities is be vulnerable. It's okay to go, I'm not really sure how to do this. Help me do it the best way possible. Accessibility really is often much easier than we think it is. All right, so that's our architectural barriers. Transportation barriers. Got a little symbol of a bus here in our transportation barriers. Often transportation services are inaccessible. There's no one, Uber, Lyft, can they navigate a power wheelchair? Nope. Inconvenient. A colleague here at the office yesterday, it took her 2.5 hours to get home on DART yesterday. She lives 2 miles from our office. Unavailable, rural areas, unsafe. Sometimes the city bus can be, bus, for example, can be unsafe for folks with disabilities. So I know y'all can't solve these, right? Like we're probably not out here all able to just revamp our public transit system and Uber and Lyft and all of those things. So we can't solve those, but it is really important to keep in mind that transportation is a major barrier to services. And y'all probably all know that already. But how can you support your clients in getting not only to you, but to their friends, to their family, to their neighbors, to groceries? Therapy doesn't happen in a bubble, right? It's not just you come here, we spend this hour, everything else is great. No, it's important that we're helping folks live their fullest lives, right? And that includes all those things outside of our therapy space. All of those things contribute to mental health and well-being, right? Getting to therapy is great, but if it's the only thing I can access, so something to think about, maybe knowing the bus route times, making sure that your services aren't happening outside of regular route time. Something else to think about is, if you've only got a 9 a.m. time slot or a 3 a.m. gracious, I hope not, as an 8 a.m. time slot. If that's requiring DART might get there. Dial-a-Ride Transit Services, apologies, DART is our paratransit in Columbia. That might require that this person is up 3 hours early. Chronic health condition, sometimes getting up 3 hours before an appointment is a major barrier. So thinking about not just can they get here, but what does that process look like? And how can we support that and be aware? All right, let's talk about program accessibility. So program accessibility ensures that people with disabilities are afforded equal access to all programs, services, and activities offered by public entities. Can't deny our benefits of programs, activities, and services to people with disabilities because our facilities are inaccessible. And all too often, again, because my role in community access right now, I get a ton of calls from people who are like, well, they told me the building is not accessible and there's nothing they can do. No, the ADA says that is not okay. The ADA says a public entity's services, programs, activities, when viewed in their entirety, must be readily accessible and usable by people with disabilities. And that's what's known as program accessibility. And a lot of folks think that something that was built before the ADA is grandfathered in. Nope, there's no such thing as grandfathered in. There are some exceptions to having to do structural renovations to become accessible, but it does not mean that we don't have to provide our services to our programs. We have to provide program accessibility. So what are some of these program barriers that we need to provide accessibility? Appointment times are hard to attend. Are they only in early morning, late afternoon? I talked a little bit about that in transportation. Lack of accessible equipment and materials. inadequate or inaccessible communication with clients or customers, clients, consumers. I remember when I was at Department of Mental Health, I worked only with deaf and hard of hearing clients, and our mental health center was adamant that we could not text or email consumers. That was a major barrier. A lot of my folks, you know, they had a TTY, maybe their video phone wasn't working, or it was difficulty doing that. Maybe they didn't know sign language, and they communicated more through written means. That was a massive barrier. Service providers don't have an accurate knowledge or understanding of disability. So maybe, you know, as a rehab counselor, you're in a setting with a lot of folks who don't have the specific knowledge that we do about people with disabilities. Is that a barrier? Does the person up front really not know anything about people with disabilities? Additionally, a misunderstanding of program accommodations. There are tons of program accommodations that really, really, really are easy. Again, I say go back to your client if you aren't sure, to brainstorm and get creative. Effective communication, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that from the therapeutic perspective. But think about also with your scheduler, with billing. If you have any of those outside folks helping provide services, they also really need to be aware of what effective communication is and how much of a barrier that can be for consumers coming to get services from you. Likewise, the stigma from secretaries, from counselors, from interns, from anybody that I might encounter when coming to your office. Are they thinking, you know, ableist ideas about people with disabilities? All right, so some program accessibility examples. Already talked about this one, but reassigning services to accessible locations, providing more places to sit, rest, observe, thinking about your lobby. Maybe your lobby is really just more a check-in space and there's not any place to sit. Maybe figuring out a way to put a bench there, right? Because if someone comes in, they've navigated this long walk from up front, typically they're not waiting long, but having a spot to sit for a second, having some water available in a water cooler, purchasing necessary equipment. That might be, you know, something like an FM system, a hearing loop. We have something called an Ubi Duo at our office to facilitate communication with folks who are deaf. Auxiliary, that word's just not going to get me today on a Friday. Auxiliary aids and services to ensure effective communication. Converting information to plain language. I see very often, especially when we might be advertising our services as counselors, and we've got this really beautiful blurb that describes who we are and what we do. Maybe that's not accessible to someone with a cognitive or an intellectual disability, or who's not, for whom English is not their first language. So think about plain language. If you aren't sure what that is, I've got some resources later on about that, but that's really writing, making written communication such that anyone can understand it. And typically that's on a 3rd or 5th grade level. It's short sentences, it's not complex words, usually words with 1 or 2 syllables only. Also having Braille or large print materials available. I will say that lots of folks who are blind or low vision are not learning Braille right now, but there are still a lot of people who use it. So if you're not sure how to have something printed in Braille, you can reach out to us, Federation for the Blind, and we can help you with that. Additionally, assisting someone with completing their paperwork. You know, all too often we're like, here's your information, fill this out before you get there. Also, is it accessible? Are you sending a form that is fillable online? If not, it needs to be. But maybe someone is, you know, with impact of multiple disabilities is looking at this form and going, I have no idea. I don't understand this question. You know, there's just so much. So is there a way for you to help them with that? If not, is that a barrier to them accessing your services? This image here, we have an image actually from Affect the Verb, which is a group of folks with varied disabilities who produce information, pictures, content to be used for free to help us find ways to include people with disabilities in the images that we use. And this is a group of people with visible and invisible disabilities, various races, sitting at a table, talking together. A few more program accessibility examples using clear and straightforward language. You know, that's something that we all learn when we're learning how to be better counselors, is communicating clear. Breaking down complex information into manageable parts. You know, if you're not sure, if you're seeing a client struggle, and again, I think these are things that probably all of you do inherently, but thinking about, am I always doing this? Is there a different way for me to explain this? Especially if I know my client has self-disclosed or they've, you know, indicated in accommodations, an intellectual or cognitive disability. Let me think about that. Maybe use visual aids, charts, diagrams, written summaries to aid in communication. Something that I did many times for with my deaf clients who oftentimes didn't know, especially my kids, or the kids I served, didn't know the names of their families or only had one name sign, was to get pictures of their family, bring them in and go, okay, so this person, we have it all in order. And I will never, ever, ever forget one of my, he was 12, and he didn't understand the system of his family. The grandparents, oh, this was mom's mom, or mom's mom, these people. So having this visual image allowed us to do so much work that we might not have ever been able to do before. For others, maybe, you know, drawing an example. I was helping another one of my clients learn about her diabetes. And we went to the grocery store and we talked about food and we looked at food. And so how can I be creative? How can I include information? That's a way to make my programming more accessible. Another critical one is accessibility training for all staff, just like y'all are doing here today, but making sure everybody in your practice has an opportunity to learn about people with disabilities, to learn about accessibility, and doing regular training, consistent annual training on best practice, on disability culture. And then if you can't do anything else, maybe there's a structural change. Maybe you really need to talk about what are we providing, how are we providing it, and how can I shift some of these structures to make my services more accessible. All right, I want to delve into effective communication just for a smidge. I talked about it can be a program barrier, but just in case some of you are not sure what effective communication means, it's required under the ADA. It ensures equal access to services. The purpose of effective communication rules is to ensure that the person with vision, hearing, speech disability can communicate with and receive information and convey information to the organization, the covered entity, but to anyone. The key to effectively communicating is to consider the nature, length, and complexity, and context of the communication and the person's normal communication method. Now, I will have still lots of folks who will say, the ADA says I have the right to an interpreter. No, the ADA says that you have the right to effective communication, and it has to be mutually agreed upon. We have to talk as provider and client, what is the best way to do this? So maybe you are chatting really quickly via text or email about appointment times or some quick supports. Maybe you won't need an interpreter for that. A full therapy session? Yeah. A full intake? Yes. So thinking about, again, the nature, length, complexity, and context helps you figure out effective communication. The rules apply to communicating with the person receiving the services, but also their parent, their spouse, a companion. If you have a consumer who, let's say, has a mobility disability, and their partner is deaf, and we've got some really critical stuff when we're bringing this partner in to talk about things. Effective communication says you need to provide effective communication for this partner, and if that is sign language, for example, then we do so. Effective communication equals accessibility. It equals accessible communication because you're meeting the needs of the person with a disability. And that really is critical. I mentioned in my bio providing, I learned American Sign Language during my master's program and provided direct therapy to people who were deaf or hard of hearing for more than 10 years. But there were still some times, because sign language, ASL was not my first language, that I needed the support of an interpreter. We were digging into something much more complex, language barriers. So effective communication needs to be evaluated at all points in time. So I'm going to give you some other examples. Oop, I did not do my image descriptions. I'm going to hop back real quick. So this is an image of Kimberly Tissot, our CEO, standing at a podium with a microphone on our State House steps at our Advocacy Day, an annual day that we do at the State House every year. And next to her is actually my friend Sharon, who is an ASL interpreter. So just give an example of effective communication there. Some other examples: plain language, talked about that already. Alternative formats, Braille, large fonts, closed captioning, providing materials in formats readily accessible to screen readers or screen enlargement applications. I mentioned final rule update to Title II entities a bit ago about accessible healthcare services. Recently, there was a 508 final rule update that said any digital and web content must be provided accessibly. That's a website, that's a booking app or link that you use. That's a PDF that you send with resources. So if you're not sure how to make sure things are accessible, reach out. We can help you with that as well. ASL, I mentioned. Inclusive language, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Trauma-informed communication, and thinking about the medical trauma that many folks with disabilities have experienced. Chronic health condition here, cancer. There are some really traumatic situations that happen as a result of medical experiences, and thinking about that and knowing about that and making sure that you're trauma informed outside of just our standard practice and learning there. Audio formats, augmentative communication, communication boards, talked a little bit about that. Knowledge of screen readers, OCRs, optical character recognition, dragon speech to text. If you've not sure what that is and have someone who uses dragon, just asking some questions. How does that work? What do you need? Video relay services and video relay interpreters. It is not, it's actually illegal by the FCC for you to have a person in your office and use a video relay service. You can use a video relay interpreter. Those two things are a little bit different. There are some nuances and caveats to that and how to make that happen. CART is open captions, live captions. So today, if we were to have this caption, we would have CART listening, actually, a live person listening to what I'm saying and typing those captions. Open versus closed captions. Open, that's just the difference of whether someone can turn them off or turn them on. And we always recommend that you have open captions so they're on all the time. Other AT, so hearing aids, cochlear implants, FMDM systems. If you're not sure about that technology, talking with someone who can inform you, hopefully your client or your consumer. Okay. I think I've covered all these notes on American Sign Language interpreters, but just in case, a sign language interpreter is a professional who takes information from English and interprets it into ASL. Just want to highlight here, interprets is spoken or signed language, translates is the written information. So they do take English and interpret it into ASL. Or vice versa, used by folks who are deaf or have hearing disabilities. You'll notice I have a capital D deaf. That indicates someone who is part of the deaf community. They may or may not have a profound hearing loss, but that indicates a predominant ASL user. Lip reading, y'all probably already know this, but I can't have spent 20 years in deafness and not stress this every opportunity possible. Lip reading is not reliable. Even for the most highly trained lip readers, about 30% of the English language is readable on the mouth. And what do I mean by that? There are so many words that can look exactly the same, phrases. So unless your client says that their most effective mode of communication is lip reading, just don't do it. Don't do it. Just like other languages, ASL has its own grammar, sentence structure. There are signed languages in other countries. So American Sign Language, there's also LSM, which is Mexican Sign Language. There's LSF, which is French Sign Language. There's BSL, which is British Sign Language. Most countries have their own, all countries have their own sign language. ASL has permeated some places, but it's critical to have qualified interpreters. It really is. I've got a link at the end on how to get a qualified interpreter if you're not sure. We did have some laws passed in South Carolina recently. We do not have licensure, but we do have a certification. But the biggest thing is never use friends or family. Never. There's really no way to know in that instance, are they even getting you the information? Are they the person that has contributed to why this person is coming to see you? Having an outsider for sure, qualified third-party person really is critical. And the biggest no ever, whether this is a deaf person, a non-English speaker, don't ever use a kid. Again, I'm sure y'all know all this stuff. But anytime I have a platform to hop on an opportunity to hop on my soapbox, I will. Never use a kid. Okay, sign language interpreters. Referral accessibility. You know, when I was looking at, again, roles of what CRCC says that we need to do to provide accessibility to our clients, one of the big things was referral accessibility. And so I was thinking about this a little bit. I was like, all right, so what do I want folks to know about this or to think about when you're making a referral? Because that's a lot of what we do, right? I, spent 10 years being primary therapist and case manager, which meant tons and tons of referrals and connections. And there's so much to think about in that. So first and foremost, is the agency or support aware of disability culture? Are they aware of ableism? Are they aware of accessibility? Are you referring to someone who is going to cause potentially more barriers, more trauma to this person? Is the referral system accessible for blind or low vision, people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities? Is their website accessible? Are they requiring an online enrollment process that's not accessible for people who are blind or low vision? Use screen readers. Are there supports there available for completing paperwork? So all those things I've asked you to do, I want you now to think about anytime you make a referral, is that an option there as well? Does the person fully understand the reason for the referral, the process, the expectations, their role in the anticipated outcomes? Again, I'm going to go back to working with folks who were deaf. So often they would talk to someone, maybe an outside case manager who was like, yeah, I got a referral for, I'm trying to think of an example, and I cannot right this second, an outside referral, and the process wasn't fully explained, or it wasn't fully explained effectively with effective communication. And so my client had no idea They didn't know the expectation. They didn't know they had to go stop by and fill out paperwork. They didn't fully understand the process. So thinking about that ahead of time, making sure that any referrals that you make are fully accessible, your client is aware of what they need to do. Is there a transportation barrier? Are they having to go to a food bank that's not on the bus route? It's in a more rural area. You've made a referral to something they can't get to. How can we navigate that? Is the building accessible? Are the restrooms accessible? All those things. I do have on here, is there anything else you can think about? Have you, you all are making referrals much more often than I am. Is there anything that I have made you think about today that leaves you going, oh, gosh, I wonder, I made this last referral. What will that be like? You got any ideas for me? And again, it's been me talking at you for 1 hour and 2 minutes. If you want to come off video, you want to come off mute, and you're like, Mary, I got something. I'll give just a second. And if y'all don't have anything for me, we'll keep going. All right. Do you want to quickly go into your legal obligations? Again, I am sure that y'all all know this already, but we're talking about this. I did want to make sure I put it in. So disability rights compliance, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and really that and the Rehab Act also, they really kind of mirror each other, right? It's just who we're talking about and where does your money come from? What funds you? How do you keep your doors open? Both of those prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, programs, places, and services. Section 504 protects folks, people with disabilities, from being treated unfairly because of their disability. 508 requires federal agencies to be accessible to everyone, and 508 is really the one that we talk more about for digital accessibility. You probably have heard is the website 508 compliant, and that's referring to that section and making sure everything is accessible. You're probably aware of all the titles of the ADA. I'm skipping around on my slides, forgive me. Title I is employment. So, if you are in a practice and you have a space available for a new rehab counselor, Title I, make sure that you aren't discriminating against a person with a disability from taking that position. Title II, state and local government offices. So if you're working for a state mental health center, making sure that you're ADA compliant there. Title III is a public accommodation. So basically everything else, private practice, museums, law offices, almost everything is a public accommodation. If you are open to the public, even if they have to apply or pay a membership, it's a public accommodation. Title IV is telecommunications. That's effective communication as well. Title V is the miscellaneous, which is really kind of the helper part of the ADA. It's there to really make sure everything runs smoothly, protects from retaliation, provides technical assistance to folks who need to understand and follow the rules of the ADA. It does clarify that states have to follow all these rules. Also said if someone needs to go to court to make sure that the rules are followed, those are attorney fees. So it's Title V, I like to think of as kind of a referee and a coach all in one, making sure that the rules are applied fairly. So super quick overview of those disability rights compliance. But with the time we have left, I'm gonna cruise through some opportunities, and we've talked about some of these. But here I have an image of a man with Down syndrome painting, and you can see some colorful art on display behind him. So talked a little bit about policies. So if you don't have an accommodations policy, develop one, or maybe think about some of these things and revise them. You need to have an effective communications policy that communicates to staff and members, clients, consumers, that you have a commitment to helping people with disabilities access those supports. It should describe how and when to ask for accommodations, outline the steps to take when a request is made, including how to meet those requests promptly. And I mentioned this, anytime you're meeting a new client in your intake process, you should have an accommodations question there. What accommodations do you need? When you're developing and you're revising your policies, it's important to work with disability rights advocates. So if you're not really sure what you need to ask, reach out to disability-led folks. That can be us. There's lots of folks around who can help you with that. What should your policies include? An annual review of accessibility using the ADA for guidance. So all those things we talked about: physical space, written material, communication, staff and volunteer opportunities, and having an action plan. If you've identified things, how are you going to fix them? Don't just say, hey, we found this problem. What's your plan? Showing the right to request accommodations on organizational materials. Make sure that's available when you're recruiting, when you're advertising, putting that there. Working agreements or memorandums of understanding with community disability organizations. And that's something that we're happy to help you with. If you're, that referral process, cross-training, we can help you with lots of those things. Intentional recruitment of people with disabilities for your board, for your volunteers, and for your staff. A line item in your budget. I cannot stress this one enough. You should have a line item in your budget. Your organization, your agency, whomever should have a line item in the budget for reasonable accommodations. And I will tell you, a lot of times folks think it's way too expensive. We have a staff of about 65. I mentioned 3/4 of our staff are people with disabilities of all types. Our annual accommodations budget is around $10,000. Y'all, that's so tiny. Our overall budget is almost $7 million. So it's a drop in our bucket, right? It's doable, but you're not going to do it if you don't fund it. So making sure that's there. Providing materials in plain language, large format, or Braille, training employees on the needs of people with disabilities and all types of disabilities. Again, not just you, but anyone in your office and practice. Identifying and advocating for systems change to reduce barriers for accessing services in all systems. And then writing your policies in plain language too. All right. The ADA, again, talks about what we have to do, right? All those laws. But beyond the law, I want to talk about not only how to be compliant, but how to be welcoming. And I love this picture. I've done some trainings for some arts organizations, and I've kept this one in here because I just love it. So it's an image from the artist Shannon Finnegan. She did these installations all over, and this one is from the Carrollton University Art Gallery. But it is an image from a corner of a museum, and on the wall in red, it says, "In service of the alchemy that happens when disabled people are connected." And there's a blue wooden chair that says, "I'd rather be sitting, sit if you agree." The step stool reads, "I need a break, rest here if you agree." And the purpose of this one was, we make art that people have to stand and walk to view. Can we make art that is also inclusive? Can we make art that is welcoming? And I liked that here because I think that one of the things we can also do in our practice is make sure that it's welcoming, right? Included. I want you to be here. And I've been very intentional about that. And I've thought about how to use my space. I've thought about how to use my services, my offerings, so that that people with disabilities know that we're welcome here. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Made myself dizzy. One of the best ways we can do that is by combating ableism. You might not have heard of ableism before. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just to talk to you about that. It's a prejudice against individuals with disabilities. Ableism discriminates against people for their physical, their intellectual, or psychiatric differences. It's an ability-based prejudice. It can take the form of exclusive attitudes from non-disabled people, also denial of access. Ableism sees non-disabled people as superior to disabled people. And it causes us to constantly be judged and our values and abilities not to be recognized. Ableism can cause our lives to be seen as less valuable than non-disabled people. And it's one of the main reasons that people with disabilities don't have equity. What does ableism even look like? I think even myself, rehab counselor, 20 years in disability space and working with folks, and having chronic health condition, having, meeting their criteria for under multiple disabilities, some of that internalized ableism. And so even when I'm looking at this and talking about ableism, there are things we all have an opportunity to reflect on, right? No matter how much we've studied. Not respecting or following disability rights laws is ableism for sure. Segregating students with disabilities into separate schools still happens all the time. But maybe that's also segregating folks with disabilities into separate counseling practices, separate offices, creating separate institutions for people with disabilities, separate work environments or programs, failing to incorporate accessibility into design plans. Y'all, it's 2024, and I just did a site assessment not long ago for a brand new building, and the number of features that were not accessible was mind-blowing. It's still happening. And I think, I invite you all to be advocates with me in that space to think about, talk about that. Buildings without Braille on signs, elevator buttons, etc. Not providing alternative formats and accessible websites. All these things we've talked about, right? These are all examples of ableism. This idea that it's a small portion of the population. It's not. It's 1 in 3 people in South Carolina, 1 in 4 nationally. But not doing these things is ableism. The thought that we need to be fixed or that we aren't normal. Using disability as a punchline, mocking people with disabilities. That one, sure, everybody's like, well, yeah, of course. Not providing reasonable accommodations and ignoring other isms. I love this line. Was made famous by Emma Lazarus, and then a lot of folks attribute it to Fannie Lou Hamer, but none of us are free until we're all free. Some examples of ableist terms. I will venture a guess that each of us has used at least one of these fairly recently, because they're things that are just so easily used, and oftentimes we don't evaluate what that language is. Falls on deaf ears. That's so R word. I'm not even gonna say it. You're such a spaz. That's lame. You're an idiot. That's nuts. He's confined to a wheelchair. Wheelchair user. Uses a wheelchair. You're such an inspiration. Lord have mercy, the people in my office who talk all the time. The number of people who have told me I have a giant cancer scar, and they're like, oh, you're such an inspiration. No, I just had cancer, and here I am, and it's great, I'm happy. Let's talk about something else. They're so dumb. I'm acting so OCD. They're so bipolar. Turn a blind eye. Why don't you have a prosthetic? I'll pray for you. All of these are examples of ableist terms, and I will tell you that every single one of these came from folks in our office, of things that they hear. How do you avoid being an ableist? First and foremost, invite us to the table. When anytime programs, policies, laws, etc., are being created, revised, anything, create equity in your planning for all marginalized groups. Listen to us when we request an accommodation. Never do anything for us without asking. Don't speak for us or our community. Again, talking about as allies, one of the most important things is to find out what we need and be a voice for us, advocate for us, raise our voices up. Keep invasive questions to ourselves. Again, we're thinking about this counseling perspective, right? Asking things that you need to know, not that you want to know. Teach your kids about disability. Almost every one of my friends that has a notable, visible physical disability will have an example of someone, their kid saying, Mom, what happened? And the mom going, or mom, parent, whomever, the adult going, shh, no, don't point. Ask questions, teach your kids about disability, right? Teach your nieces, nephews, babysitting, whomever. Educate others about those harmful effects of ableism that I just talked to you about. Use your platform as an ally to call your friends out when they're saying, the R word. Include us in everything. and then don't pity us. This is our life. And woo, I got 15 minutes left. Okay. I'm going to go through my next slides pretty quick. I've talked a little bit about inclusive language. I've just sort of modeled some inclusive language for you. I'm sure you're all aware of person first versus identity first. I remember learning about this. It's all throughout CRCC materials and information. It's something we think about and use every day, but I just want to reinforce it's important to use the language that people use to describe themselves. Person first is the person before the descriptor, right? Identity first leads with the descriptor. The 65 employees in our staff, and again, roughly 80-ish% of us have disabilities. We all might identify differently and use different language. So talking with folks to find out. This is another image from Disabled in Here, or Affect the Verb, a group of people with varied races and ethnicities and disabilities standing against a wall, and one is holding a sign, Disabled in Here. Some examples of language matters. People with disabilities, not differently abled, y'all, and I can't stress this enough, differently abled, handy-capable, special needs. I'm sure that y'all aren't using that language, but just in case, that's a huge sticking point from members of the disability community. My needs aren't special, they're just my needs. It's just what I need to get through. You know, we use non-disabled folks use accommodations all day, every day, and we don't call those special. I like to have the lights on because it makes it easier to see. I like to sit in a chair because I don't want to stand all day. People who are blind, people with low vision, not the blind or visually impaired, people who are deaf, hard of hearing, not hearing impaired, people of short stature, not dwarf. And you'll see these words here with asterisks in the middle. I'm not going to say those words. All of those are typed that way because those are perceived as slurs by the disability community. I'm going to let you insert that word and read for yourself. People with learning and intellectual disabilities, not stupid, slow, dim, dumb, R-word. People with psychiatric disabilities, not C-word, psycho, insane, idiot. People with a speech disability, not speech impediment. There's a lot more examples. We have an entire inclusive language guide. If you're not sure and you're like, oh, we want to reevaluate some of the things in content that we're producing, that's a link at the end. I welcome you to check that out. And here I have an image from one of the attendees who came to our 2023 Advocacy Day for Access and Independence. And we always have signage, and we stand on the road right there at the State House and invite folks to join us in our advocacy. And her sign says, "We have a voice." And I think that just really kind of highlights this language matters part of listening to the disability community. Inclusive counseling practices are easy. They really are. Requires intentionality. I think the fact that there are so many folks here demonstrates how intentional all of you are in learning how to expand your practices, learn a little bit more, grow a little bit more, and already being intentional about that. So, what can you do? Last couple things. You can learn and advocate. Talked already about this, rethinking disability and how you use the word, emphasizing information, access, and opportunities benefits everybody. And there's so many examples of that accessible spaces, programs, all of that, that makes life easier, better for everybody. Make disability equity a leader-driven priority. Develop spaces and structures and processes that support equity. Go one further and learn about universal design. Understand and address the social determinants of inequity, and understand that some people need more accessibility, regardless of disability. When you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person. Confront those institutional biases and address plans to combat all of the ableisms, or all of the isms: ableism, racism, sexism, ageism. You know, if you're in a practice, if you're in an agency, being a voice for that, again, being an ally, being an advocate, and how can you move those things forward? Promoting dignity of risk. What is dignity of risk? It is the principle of allowing an individual the dignity afforded by risk-taking with subsequent enhancement of personal growth and quality of life is the definition of that. We oftentimes will readily and easily give non-disabled people the opportunity to take risks, to mess up. But for some reason, the non-disabled community struggles to give that to people with disability. Adults, all adults, have the right to make their own decisions, and we should assume that they can do so unless there's evidence to the contrary. Capacity determination should not be broadly applied, be time limited and situation specific. We have a whole presentation, I believe it's happening next week on guardianship and alternatives to that. I hope that you will go watch that, think about that, learn more about that. Every time I see Allie present on that, I learn something new. I think that's so important. Adults should be offered all reasonable support and assistance in making and following through on decisions before we ever step in to make decisions for a person. And not avoiding risks, instead focusing on how you can support a person with a disability. Do they want to go skydiving? Do they moving out onto their own? Dignity of risk. All right, strategies to support sustainability. Gone through all of these. Missed my image description again. We got 2 folks from Advocacy Day, 2 ladies sitting on a bench, or one on a bench, one using a wheelchair. Signs say rights, not charity, and then I am able. So back to these strategies to support sustainability. Written policies regarding ongoing review. We talked about that a little bit. Collaborative partnerships with strong, respectful relationships. Inviting individuals with disabilities, mentioned that already. Have enthusiastic champions within your organization. Maybe that's you. You're here today. Maybe you go back and you're like, all right, I know what I got to do. I'm really going to take a look at some of these things in our practice, in our organization, in our agency, and I'm going to help come up with a process for evaluating where we are accessible and where we're not. And then have some tools to measure your effectiveness. I can help you with some of those too. Again, budget for reasonable accommodations and modifications. Access to services for people with disabilities is essential to include, and I know y'all are all doing that. And then keeping in mind, it's not a one-time effort, it's continuous. Accessibility is a journey. Start where you start. But that's the most important thing, get started. It's not a one-time effort, it's a continuous value that can be embedded into the culture of your organization with some intention. Did it again. Image description here, we have got a young person with a shaved head in a wheelchair and another person with long brown hair leaning over in their lap, and they're sitting outside on a walkway. And this image here is a whole bunch of people, mixed races and ethnicities, visible and invisible disabilities, cheering, arms up, celebrating, because meeting your legal obligations really is easy. The first step in that is understanding what you have to do and making it an intentional process. And again, if you don't know, ask. Ask us. There's so many great resources. That really is the first step, is just not being afraid to ask. When we know better, we do better, right? But we don't know everything. Lastly, what can happen if you don't know and don't ask? Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has complaints about employment discrimination. Department of Justice receives complaints about program accessibility. And I will say, if a complaint is made about some programmatic access, they are going to come into your program and they're going to evaluate everything, not just the thing that a complaint was made about. So the best thing to do is follow those practices. Again, if you're not sure, let us know. Let's see. I see a question here. Dr. Olkin, does the law require a line item in a budget for accommodations for companies over 50 employees. I don't believe so. I can look in that and get you a final answer. It does require providing services, and you have an ADA coordinator for companies over 50 employees, whether Title II or Title III, and that you have policies, procedures, a complaint process. But I don't believe there is anything specific in there about having a budget. They just say you got to do it. And to do it, you need to have a budget. So closing reminders here, every person is different and needs will vary. If you met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person. Accessibility is an ongoing process, but it's beneficial to everybody. And then finally, consult disability-led organizations like ABLE. Asking folks with disabilities is the best way to be an ally and to help that process. Okay. We've got 4 minutes left, y'all. I've got tons of resources and references here. All of these are going to be available to you. My slides are going to be available. Welcome you again to reach out to me with any questions that you have. Normally I have my contact information on my slides, but for some reason I don't have that today. So I'll put my email here in the chat. While I'm giving y'all a couple minutes, 3 minutes to answer questions. I can stick around. I know we'll have to stop the recording, but I can stick around if folks, if you have questions, please do. Again, you're welcome to come off of mute and ask anything that you have. So this has been super great. Really appreciate y'all having me. Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you, Mary, for such an informative presentation. I know everyone's enjoyed it. It does look like we addressed everything that came in during the presentation from the chat. So, and thank you for volunteering to stay back and after the webinar with anyone who might have additional questions. I'm also just going to reiterate that you did put your email in the chat, and that looks like it is mreaves@able-sc.org for those who may not be able to view the chat at this time. So I'm just going to wrap us up and then anyone who would like to ask some questions could stay behind. So we would like to provide our sincere gratitude to Mary Reaves for this wonderful and meaningful presentation on programmatic and environmental accessibility and overview of expectations and opportunities. And we're so glad, Mary, that you were able to take the time to share with us all today. For those in attendance, we appreciate you joining us today, and we would like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar as part of our month-long June 2024 webinar series, which is scheduled for next Friday, June 21st, 2024. That's from 10 a.m. Eastern to 11:30 Eastern. And this is the one that Mary had just mentioned, supported decision-making and other alternatives to guardianship, promoting the least restrictive measures. Please be sure to review our entire month-long June 2024 webinar series program and sign up for our remaining webinars each Friday of this month. More information can be found in the chat box. So we hope you'll consider joining us. And on behalf of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, we'd like to thank you all again and wish you all a wonderful weekend.